Hi everybody, and welcome to the first of a series of chess videos that I've decided to put together to kind of chronicle my comeback to chess after many years of away from the game. I'd like to start this series with one of my own personal games from the other night. I've decided that, after each game I'll do my usual analysis, then I'll present a brief video on that game, and hopefully it'll be of use to other chess enthusiasts. My opponent kicked off with e4, and I responded classically in the center with e5. White played knight to f3, and I responded with knight c6. And we went into a Ruy Lopez. Of course, there are many different variations of the Ruy Lopez. I just decided to play a6, hitting the bishop. The two most common replies here is bishop a4 and bishop takes c6. He went with bishop a4, and I continued development with knight to f6, just challenging the center. White castled, and then I decided to play the open variation, which starts out with knight takes e4. Of course, black isn't going to keep the pawn after the rook swings over to the e file. So the rook comes to e1, and he's exerting some pressure down this e file, and he's going to win back the pawn. This is all normal opening theory so far. So black brings the knight to c5, which is hitting the bishop and also preparing to bring the knight back to this e6 square, where it's in a useful defensive centralized position. So he's basically swapped off on c6 now, and I recapture with the d pawn, which actually liberates the light squared bishop and gives the queen access to these squares on the d file. Of course, black also has the advantage of the two bishops, or the bishop pair as we refer to it. So anyway, he responded now with a surprising move, which is rook takes e5 check. Now, this is a slight inaccuracy. Normally we would see white recapturing with the knight, and the reason that you would normally recapture with the knight is because the rook is really better operating from a long distance in this early part of the middle game, because the rook is just going to be subject to attacks from pawns and minor pieces, and it's really best kept out of harm's way for the time being. So let's look at briefly at the more common lines. So we have something like knight takes e5. Black would continue development with bishop e7. You might have a move like d4, just hitting out at the center. Black would play something like knight e6 and then bishop e3. That's more typical. But anyway, we had rook takes e5 check, and I just basically retreated the knight to e6. Another option would have been bishop to e6. And then we see d3. Now, this move struck me as slightly odd because it's a fine move. I mean, it's a useful move. It prepares to develop the dark squared bishop, but it makes me wonder why we wouldn't just play d4. So if you come to d4, you're controlling some very useful squares in the center which can no longer be occupied by black pieces. So d3 it just seems a little bit passive. Anyway, let's go back to the game variation, which is d3. Okay, so at this point I played bishop e7. May have been an inaccuracy. The bishop is actually better on d6 because it would be with a tempo, and immediately the rook would have to move. But anyway, he continues with knight d2. Now, this maneuver of knight d2 is something that we commonly see in the closed Ruy Lopez. You'll see this maneuver where the knight first comes to d2, then to f1, and then e3 or possibly g3. So it's a kind of slow maneuvering positional idea that is more commonly seen in the closed Ruy Lopez because white has more time for these kind of maneuvers. But I'm not sure that this is normally seen in the open game. I'll have to check my database and perhaps someone else can comment on that. Okay, so after knight d2 I decided to evict the rook from e5 and at the same time put the bishop onto this nice long diagonal. So from here the bishop starts to exert some nice pressure here. So what does white do? Well, personally I think the natural move is rook e1, and certainly my silicone friend here seems to agree with me. However, my opponent played rook e2, and I think the idea behind this move is that eventually he's going to aim to double up the rooks, so the rook that's currently on a1 would eventually find a home on e1 and he would have these nice doubled rooks. But unfortunately it has kind of a cramping effect on his game, and we'll see later that there's some potential problems caused by this along this diagonal. So we'll look out for that later.